Hi class, welcome to our last video on gender and behavior where you're going to be learning about gender issues in the workplace. So what will you learn about? You'll learn about sexism and something called benevolent sexism. You'll also learn about two forms of economic discrimination and something called the glass ceiling and what might account for it. You'll also be learning about sexual harassment and different forms of it and some of the characteristics of targets. But keep in mind, anyone can be a target. And then you'll also be learning about the effects of sexism and harassment, as well as ways to reduce each. Issues related to sex and gender make their way into the workplace, and sexism is discrimination against people on the basis of their gender. It's primarily experienced by women, but it is also experienced by men. For example, let's imagine that we have a male who works in a early childhood care center. And let's say that the man is a teacher and he is seeking a promotion, but the person who is hiring for that new job does not think that men are as nurturing or as caring or as intuitive or as sensitive to children's needs as women are. So that hiring manager then may, because of their biases, may not be as likely to interview the man, or perhaps may be harsher in terms of judgment of the man when he's being interviewed, so that we see that the man is not going to have the same opportunities for growth within his career as women typically do. And so when we think about workplace discrimination, again, it is not just experienced by women, it is also experienced by men. But when we think about the jobs in which, or the opportunities for promotion, oftentimes these opportunities are to move into leadership positions. And think about then the stereotypes about men and women and how men are more typically, based on what the literature has to say, viewed as being assertive, as being dominant, as possessing the qualities that are related to or associated with being a leader, and that when women have those qualities, they don't tend to be viewed as positively, as we talked about that concept of androcentrism. How then might that play out in the workplace? We know that there are a disproportionate percentage, or there's a disproportionate percentage of men who are holding leadership positions in large corporations across the country. There are different reasons for why women may not be in those positions, some of which may be related to a woman choosing to take time off work because she wants to take care of her child when she gives birth. But when a woman is not given opportunity to be promoted because of her gender, we are talking about sexism. And actually, this is when someone experiences discrimination based on sex, this is illegal. And benevolent sexism is where a person has positive feelings about an individual, but they still treat the person in restricting ways. So examples might be someone saying things like women have motherly nurturing instincts, or women are more compassionate, or women are more intuitive, or women tend to be more organized. And so someone may make these or have these positive feelings about women, but perhaps they don't allow women in a workplace, let's say, to have the same opportunities as men. So it's not as though they're viewing women negatively, but they may feel that those women don't have the other qualities that are needed to be in those leadership positions. I think benevolent sexism is something too that you all may have experienced yourselves. So I think of, let's imagine you have a family member who's just recently had a baby and the baby's crying. And who is it that they think can help to console the baby from crying outside of the mother and father who just had the baby? Let's think about, who are they going to give that baby to if the mother or father's not around? Do they typically ask that or seek out a woman, or are they seeking out a man? And when we look for women to be more nurturing, then we can think about how this may direct our behavior in that example. And so we then might assume a man won't be as competent at helping to relieve the child's distress, and that a woman would be more competent. So here, her the belief or stereotype that we hold that women are more nurturing has led one to give the child to the woman to help console the child, which is great for the woman. But what about for the man? What about for the man who may also be very good at nurturing? How then does that make him feel? And then also, how then does that make the woman feel? How does she feel about the pressure to help that baby to stop crying? Does she feel like she should naturally be able to do this? Does this then, in a way, relate back to our stereotypes about what women should be able to do? And then how does that affect her, how she sees herself if she's unable to do that? If we look at the most recent Census Bureau data from 2018, women of all races combined earned on average just 82 cents for every dollar earned by men of all races for the same job. So we know that women are making less money than men for doing the same thing. And sometimes it can be difficult to, in a workplace, to prove this. And the reason it can be difficult is because wages are often something we don't talk about. And so we may not know that our male counterparts are making more or that our female counterparts are making less. You may not even know this until you leave the company that you were at and someone talks about the salary that they were making. And so there are instances of lawsuits that have been after the fact where someone comes to the realization that for all of the years that they were working at a particular company, they were making significantly less than their male counterparts for the same job. And there has, in fairly recent times, been legislation that has been enacted in order to extend the amount of time that between when a woman has worked at a workplace and received unequal pay and when she can sue. And this is because women may not realize that there's a discrepancy until after the fact. We also know that there are differential levels of access to jobs and that women are less likely to hold positions with decision-making authority and that women are, they experience differential treatment on the job as well. And this is overall, this is certainly not in every single business. Overall, if we look as a collective, we see that there are differences. There are certainly many companies that have excellent histories of treating men and women equally and providing equal opportunities for growth, where companies focus not on what a person's gender or sex is, but instead focus on what they're able to contribute. But then, of course, there are also companies that don't do this. And that's why we have laws in place to prevent this type of discrimination. Additionally, in the workplace, related to gender, is this concept of a glass ceiling. And this is an unseen barrier that prevents most women and ethnic minorities from advancing to top-level positions. The glass ceiling is improving. I do want to mention that if we go back 15 years ago, data from magazine Fortune, which provides data related to executive leadership and other important data related to businesses, indicated that 15 years ago, women held 15.7% of board seats at Fortune 500 companies. And then today, though, we see that women hold 25.5% of those seats. So we're seeing an increase in the percentage of women who are in high-level positions. I also want to point out, though, that if we think about representation and we think about our government, the United States ranks 75th out of 193 countries for the percentage of women held congressional seats. We are at 24.1% representation. Women are at 24.1% representation, which is, of course, not in line with the distribution of males versus females in throughout our society. So we're seeing many fewer women who are in high-level positions that have an influence on policy. Another concept that's related to the workplace is the glass elevator, and this is where men are, who are employed in traditionally female fields may sometimes be promoted more quickly than their female counterparts. So perhaps they're given they're seen in a more favorable light than those who are, than their female counterparts. Also, I want to mention too that this might be related to stereotypes that are very traditional, that men are thought of as being stronger or more capable leaders. And so this may then lead men who are in these traditionally held female fields to be promoted into leadership positions. Another issue related to sex and gender in the workplace is sexual harassment. And this refers to any unwelcome conduct or advance that is sexual in nature. And certain behaviors may be considered sexual harassment when they interfere with a person's job, when they create an offensive work environment, or intimidate the employee. And these behaviors can range very significantly. And they can range from making or distributing offensive jokes to inappropriate touching, or to pressuring someone to engage in a personal or sexual relationship. It's a very serious problem that does not only victimize women, as men are also victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. There are laws that protect people who are experiencing sexual harassment, and this actually began with this began with law in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. That was when it became illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. And even after this law was passed, the first sexual harassment cases weren't brought until the 1970s, and the Supreme Court didn't consider this to be an issue until the 1980s. So it's fairly recent that that people who have been sexually harassed have had legal protections, and that it has been against the law and it has been enforced for people to sexually harass another person in the workplace. There are two categories of sexual harassment. There's quid pro quo and hostile environment harassment. Quid pro quo is where there's an expectation to give in to sexual demands in exchange for employment, raises, or promotions. And then hostile environment harassment involves exposure to sexist or sexually oriented comments, cartoons, or posts. So who is vulnerable to sexual harassment? Anyone can be a victim of sexual harassment. I want to point out, though, that women are more likely to be the victims of sexual harassment. And women who are seen as being more vulnerable and women who are seen as stronger are often the targets of harassment among women. And then women who have experienced interpersonal violence or who have gone against gender role expectations are also more likely to be harassed. I would like to also point out that minority women are more likely to be harassed than white women or men. What are the effects of sexual harassment? Perceived discrimination is related to increased depression, distress, and stress response. Also, sexual harassment is related to lower job satisfaction, less engagement at work, poor physical and mental health, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So ultimately, sexual harassment does not only affect the victim, it affects the entire workplace. It affects the productivity of the company as well. It affects the ability of the company to be profitable. If we think about nonprofits or we think about educational institutions, it affects nonprofits and educational institutions' ability to reach their mission and reach their goals. So no one wins at all when there is sexual harassment. So how do we combat sexual harassment? Well, organizations need to make sure that they provide opportunities for success for disadvantaged group members and also have more transparent policies for hiring and promotion. They also need to adopt clearly communicated zero tolerance policies and safe ways to report violations, and they need to have diversity training. Let's take a moment for you to test yourself. Professor Garcia is in her 70s and she walks slowly with a cane. Often male students will attempt to open and hold the door for her, but she often remarks, "I can do it for myself." Professor Garcia may be interpreting people's actions as blank sexism, hostile, benevolent, gender, or economic. If you answered benevolent, you're right. Benevolent sexism is very subtle, and it definitely is not coming from a place of negative beliefs that a person has about another person based upon their sex. But oftentimes, Benevolent sexism is reinforcing stereotypes that we might have about gender. So here's an example. Let's say that we have Karen and we have Ben, and they're both eagerly waiting their annual performance reviews from their manager. And while Karen's review praises her for being a likable team player that people like working with, let's say that Ben's review focuses on his efficacy as a team leader and his tough negotiation skills. Now, both of these reviews are positive, but we see here that Karen's review focuses on her likability, while Ben's focuses on leadership and toughness. Now, it may be that those are Karen's strengths, and it may be that those are Ben's strengths. But if we tended to see that a leader tends to review females in an organization in that way, in the way that he reviewed Karen, and he tends to review males in the way that he reviewed Ben, then we can think about how this may negatively impact women and their opportunity in the workplace. And we can also think about the pressure then that men may experience in the workplace to maintain certain behaviors, and that they may not be valued for certain behaviors that aren't in line with that traditional stereotype, even though those values can be great in a workplace. So what's happening with benevolent sexism is that it's supportive while simultaneously reinforcing the virtues of traditional gender roles and their responsibilities and different capabilities. So in this instance, Professor Garcia, she's interpreting it possibly this way. That does not mean that that's the intent of another individual, but it may be that she's interpreting it this way, and our interpretation is important. Here's another one. Kay identifies as a man at school, but identifies as a woman at work. And on weekdays, Kay may identify as a woman at times, while other times as a man. There are also times when Kay rejects gender labels altogether. So Kay is demonstrating the notion of, is it transgendered behavior, androgynous behavior, post-gender reality, or gender fluidity? If you selected gender fluidity, you're right. Now, you may come across the term, you very likely will actually, the term cisgender, and this means a person's gender identity matches the sex, female or male. And this is the sex that they're designated on their original birth certificate. Now, gender fluidity refers to change over time in a person's gender expression or their gender identity or both. And that change might be in expression but not identity, or in identity but not expression. Or it could be in both expression and identity. So both may change together. And so for some people, especially when they are in adolescence, gender fluidity may be a way to explore gender before landing on a more stable gender expression or identity. And then for others, gender fluidity may continue indefinitely as part of their life experience with gender. In this module, you've learned that sex and gender are complex topics. You've learned about some important concepts related to sex and gender, and you've also learned about some of the research on gender similarities and differences, and what the research says may contribute to some of the differences that we see. You've also learned about the traditional male and traditional female role and the impact of these traditional roles on how males and females see themselves. And then you had the opportunity to think about how you can apply much of what you've learned about sex and gender to workplace issues. So in this video, you've learned about sexism and benevolent sexism. You also learned about two forms of economic discrimination. You learned about the glass ceiling and what might account for it. You also learned about sexual harassment and two different forms of it and some of the characteristics of targets. But keep in mind, again, that anyone can be a target. And you also learned about the effects of sexism and harassment, as well as ways to reduce each. As always, if you have any questions as you're reading or after watching any of the videos, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.